Welcome to the Stronger for Business podcast with Divrig Jenkins, Pete Rushmer, and myself, Bev Thorogood. Stronger for Business is a training consortium dedicated to bringing high-quality training solutions to businesses through the combined expertise of our partners. From skills training to developing personal and professional excellence, our mission is to help business owners get the very best from their people at all levels, from boardroom to shop floor. The Stronger for Business podcast is our opportunity to share our knowledge, thoughts and ideas with you, the listener. You'll get to meet some awesome guests from across the business world, sharing their experience of learning and development. If you love what we have to say, make sure you hit the subscribe button on whatever platform you use to consume your podcasts so you don't miss out on future episodes. We'd love to hear from you with your suggestions for discussion topics or ideas for future guests. And if you really love what you hear, please do consider leaving us a 5-star review, as this helps to get the podcast out to a wider audience. Sit back and enjoy the Stronger for Business podcast. Hello, welcome to episode 10. We've got the S4B team here today, but we've also got a guest. And I do love the podcasts when we have a guest. And I'm really excited to introduce our guest today. His name is Woosh Raza, and he is HR Director. Let me hope I get this right. HR Director for Phoenix Futures?
Head of HR and L&D.
Head of HR. Woosh, I shall take a step back because I would love you to introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about what you do in your current role, and a bit of background to you, and then we'll get into the meat of the chat.
Well, thank you. Thanks for inviting me, and thanks, Bev, for introducing the session. Really excited to be here, having hopefully a really good conversation. So my name is Woosh Raza. I currently head up the HR and L&D function for a charity organisation called Phoenix Futures. We're a charity that specialises in substance abuse addictions treatment. So we specialise in providing support to those individuals that are either going through recovery as a result of an alcohol or a drug addiction, or need access to support and treatment in order to aid their recovery. I am so proud of the work that we do. It's an inspired cause, very much draws on, I guess, some of the narrative that we'll have in this conversation around the principles of stigma, challenging that stigma around addiction, working with vulnerable groups, and being their kind of champions and advocates. And we work in a variety of settings that make the job really interesting and make the environment really varied. So we work in prisons, we work in hospital settings, we work in community settings, we actually have residential rehab centres and rehab kind of accommodation-based rehab providers as well. We're all over England and Scotland. So yeah, really interesting kind of mixture, but of the ethos and the culture behind Phoenix Futures is very much, challenging that stigma around addiction, helping people overcome that addiction in the best way that we possibly can. So yeah, I look after the HR, L&D, OD and talent teams. So I've got a nice, very broad remit to my role, which I absolutely love. Prior to that, so I guess in the last decade, I've really built my career in health and social care. For me, that's been a real important, where I chose to grow my career was really, really important for me. And I really did decide, give it some thought in the sense of mental health, addictions. I've worked in housing services. I've worked for the NHS. I've worked for private organisations such as the Priory Group and other mental health providers as well. So last decade, really senior HR roles, I guess, looking into operational delivery, but also that strategic change management and that cultural change piece. So that's a little bit more about me. I hope that kind of gives listeners a bit of a flavour, I guess, of my weird and varied career history and currently what I'm doing.
Brilliant. I noticed you've not been in your current role that long, have you?
No.
About 6 months?
It's been the weirdest 6 months of my life. Started at the end of January, and then obviously like lockdown and the pandemic, and actually a brand new team. So when I took over the team, there was significant gaps across the whole team. So a lot of the team and myself are relatively new in, and I think in a way, I was lucky to be able to go to service visits, actually spend some time with our operational teams, and see some of the work that we were doing, and actually go to our rehab centres as well, which I'm really glad, it really kind of gave me a real grounding, real shape around what we do. But it's been an interesting time. Yeah, so it's not been long, and the team are very new. I think it's fast tracked that team development piece, because we really have to come together, I guess, in the midst of what's been happening in the midst of this pandemic. Especially as HR and L&D have been seen as that critical providers of business continuity and providing support to the wider organisation, specifically around culture, flexible working, agility, looking at those principles that have helped us and navigated the wider organisation through that time.
Yeah,
Yeah.
brilliant.
So yeah,
Baptism of fire comes to mind.
baptism of fire, absolutely.
So really we wanted to talk to you today about diversity and inclusion, and I know you're very passionate about the whole diversity, equality in the workplace. So if I may, can we talk about where that passion comes from? I will invite the other guys to come in and talk. I know I tend to talk too much, and I will step back. But where does that passion come from?
Yeah, I think my personal identity is what really drives my vested interest in it. I'm in a really interesting position, because I have the corporate responsibility of driving D&I in the nature of the work that I do, and the fact that I work in human resources and HR, and actually D&I seeing as an HR kind of initiative. Which I could talk about. It shouldn't, but we are seen to be, we're leading that particular piece of work. And I guess my own lived experience of someone that's experienced racism, let's call it what it is. It's someone who has been a person of color. I'm coming from a Muslim background, also being gay. I'm a gay man. So I think what's really driven me, and the passion behind it, is that intersectional element of my identity. So I've had experience on both elements, and I think that puts me in a really interesting space, because culturally within my own community, and when I say my own community, it's interesting. So I talk about my own community within, say, my family and friends. Being gay isn't necessarily something that has been easy, and hasn't necessarily led to inclusion in that sense. But likewise, I've also experienced racism within the LGBT community, specifically when it came to my early kind of experiences of getting into adulthood, and starting to go and meet individuals. So I've discrimination has been something I've seen, unfortunately, as a result of being in this kind of crossroad, for want of a better word, and that's really spurred me on, in the sense of wanting the world to be a better place for obvious reasons. But more specifically, I think the more I started being open and honest and sharing my own experiences, so the more humanizing, I'm trying to explain the more I was humanizing this particular issue for the organizations I was working in, the more I was seeing the change that really spurred me on to then speak to other HR and L&D professionals and say, are we making this an academic issue? Because actually, I feel like my success in this kind of space has really come from me being able to share my own experiences and lived experience of that. And I think that's been a huge driver for some of the passion that I've had, and actually some of the my kind of determination to make this conversation, to keep this conversation going, and to bring it down to an authentic level, in how we approach this issue from a corporate perspective.
Brilliant. I'm going to invite Pete and Dovrig to come in and join in on the conversation, because I realise that you've not spoken yet. So, guys, feel free to just chip in with the conversation, ask questions. Go ahead.
Where do we start, though? Like,
I know.
so many questions in so little time, right? Absolutely
It's Friday
fascinating.
afternoon. It's all good.
Absolutely fascinating. I've got so many questions to ask you. It's just like, I think it's so powerful that you come from a place of experience as well, like real lived experience with some of the challenges that you come across with like that people have faced. Have you? How's your experience firsthand with substance abuse in particular?
Yeah. I think it's interesting. We were talking about this. I was actually having a discussion about this week with our executive team, because one of the things that we want to do with Phoenix in particular is look at D&I, but from a position so looking at that diversity inclusion piece, but not just looking at it from a staffing perspective, actually, because we are a provider of care services. What are we doing in the sense of diversity inclusion from a broader perspective of operational and service delivery? And one of the questions I was thinking about is access to services for drug and alcohol addiction for the LGBT community in particular. So my own experiences of that have been, I have gone down being a young gay man, I think, and especially in London, I think being that kind of environment, that it's so accessible for you to I guess use drugs and alcohol as a way of coping, but also as a way of socializing. Like, we normalize that so much in the LGBT community. And I think for me, I was really aware of the fact that this was a huge part of the social circles that I wanted to be involved in. So I felt like I had no kind of, it wasn't peer pressure, but it was a sense of what else is there? Because you don't have another frame of reference really when you're in that space. So I'm very, very lucky in the sense that I met my partner quite early on, and he gave me, we traveled the world together like really early on, and I feel so lucky and blessed, because I feel like I easily could have had I could have gone down a completely different path. And it was, like I say, a chance that I met my partner who I'm engaged with now, and and then I have a support network around me. I had a really good group of friends. But for a lot of people, specifically the LGBTQIA communities, it's we know that environment exists. I don't necessarily think we have enough out there to be able to signpost people to or advocate those services to those individuals. And that's something that we've been talking about at Phoenix in terms of how we can provide that kind of holistic support on D&I, not just looking at staff, but actually, given the nature of the work that we do in drug and alcohol addiction, is how can we utilize that to make the world a better place.
Yeah, thank you. That was that's really fascinating, because it's something that's personal to me as well. My sister's trans and had major substance issues, lived on the street for a long period of time, now actually has quite high profile exec IT security roles.
Yeah.
So it's never like an opportunity issue, it was more sort of personal issue. So yeah, it's just really interesting to you talk about that. So Dov, I'll let you speak now. Sorry.
How long have we been going now? Hi, Woosh. It's really good to talk to you. It's the first time that we've met today. I think the first one is an observation, really. And I suppose, through your background and everything and your experiences that you just said, I think in your role, because it is, to use your word, authentic, that you can bring so much to your organisation and to the people that you look after, but also have the voice at the boardroom table as well. So I think you used the term the critical internal provider, because often, going back into the HR and the L&D part, historically, HR particularly has been the kind of people that you wheel into the boardroom when there's a problem.
Yeah.
Proactively or reactively. And
Yep.
It's just, when people need to be hired or fired, and kind of wheel them in. And I think in more progressive organizations, whether it's in the public sector, the charity sector, or private, people now who are authentic and credible HR leaders are now taking a major seat, maybe not the seat, because that's usually the chair or the CEO, but who are really influencing, and like I said earlier, are now taking those roles where they go, right, okay, how are we going to drive this business forward? Because there's almost like an ancillary service who are there informing and influencing the rest of the people around the board table, but also more widely in the community as well. So
Absolutely.
it's really, really great to hear that. And I think I'm going to come away a little bit to come around to the question I want to ask. So there's some news in Peterborough yesterday. For those of our listeners, quite a lot of our listeners are based around Peterborough, because this is our community, if you like. There's a major charity in Peterborough has had to close because of COVID and because of lack of funding as well. And they provide loads. It's quite different charity, very different to the one that you work in and support. But they provide lots of leisure and culture facilities, and have done for 10 years. And sadly, because of circumstances, they've had to fold literally this week. So, from your perspective, the work that you do, where do you get your funding from, and what direction do you get, if you like, externally to help with that strategy across England and Scotland too?
Yeah, it's a very good question, and it's really humbling to hear, and I guess makes the impact real when I hear the examples of like how and what you've just mentioned there, Divrig, in the sense of charities and small businesses, local businesses having to close as a result of the pandemic. It really does. You can't detach yourself from what's happening, I think, on a global level. So first and foremost, anyone out there who is going through that, really do. My heart goes out to those individuals. We're lucky. We're really lucky because as a charity provider, we have navigated through some really turbulent times historically, where we've had periods of low funding or potential contracts of 2P, that whole classic where it comes to local authority contracts, where you get contract coming in, a contract going out. And I think we've had a really strong financial a baseline, and our director of finance has been and our finance approach has been very, very commercial over the last, say, decade or so, which has meant that we've been able to weather the particular challenges that we have this year, with the fact that we were really, one of the things that again inspires me about Phoenix is our approach to our culture. In moments of crisis or crisis management, it was clear that we went with that position of trust. So we said from the beginning, actually, when this first hit at the end of March, that said, some of you are going to need time off, whether that's personally because you've got symptoms, whether that's because you're shielding, whether that's because you've got family, friends, and whether it's because you've now got childcare that you wouldn't have to have considered. Whatever time off you need, we will give you that time off, and we will remunerate that in full. And us taking that position early on was a really powerful, for me, it really kind of built on the culture work, because at the time I was looking at that kind of culture of, how do we enable trust and collaboration? But us taking an organizational position with that very, very early on meant that we didn't really see, touch wood, too much then of an impact of absence management, because what we then got was that real camaraderie and that real team morale of like saying, actually, you know what, I might not be able to travel into my normal service, but I've got a service that's closer to me that I can, and I can carpool, or people will come, making it work. And we really did see that commitment come through. That's not to say that, we didn't have, high levels of absence. We absolutely did. One thing that's carried us through that is the strong financial reserves that we've been able to build up as a result of very, very commercial decisions around contract management, but also, I guess, being able to forecast and navigate quite well in advance, really, around what may or may not have happened. So we're really, really lucky on that front, and we're still able to, like I say, that organizational position on time off and how we pay them is still effective. It's still something we're able to offer today. In terms of funding, though, that's probably a different conversation, because we have seen a decline in funding in drug and alcohol addiction treatment, and that's as a result of, I guess, strategic government decisions, which is a real shame, because we're obviously, our CEO passionately advocates and champions the message that this treatment is vital. It's life-saving treatment. It really, really is. People's lives that are at risk. We are seeing a bigger focus on mental health streams. So we are looking at the future in the sense of I think there's a real connection between addictions and treatments and supporting from a mental health perspective. We know that there's a holistic way that we can look at that and broaden our psychosocial offer. So yeah, we've been lucky in the sense of internally we've been able to reserve for moments of crisis like we're seeing. Externally, we are looking at the landscape and how we can continue to provide those services, but with a broader outlook.
Yeah, it's fascinating. And it's really, this is the first time we've spoken to you, as everybody's heard, and started to get some insight into your organisation. But I think there's something, I don't know, heartwarming, if that's the right term, to know that there are charities who really have a strategic focus and have a commercial mindset as well, because I don't think there is any other way, excuse me, any other way to operate these days, especially with times where the world is so volatile and will probably continue to be quite volatile, maybe not to the extent that it is now, but big changes in society and the environment, and to have cash reserves and a commercial mindset is really, really important.
Yeah, absolutely.
Could I bring it back to the sort of D&I piece? Can I ask your thoughts on how do we raise awareness about diversity without putting people in boxes and labeling them? And how do we do that? I know that is that too big a question, but we want to raise awareness of the different types of people, and it's not just about colour or sexuality. I think it's about the way people think. It's about age. It's about gender. It's about the whole lot. How do we not pigeonhole people?
I think that's a great question, and I don't know if I've got the answer, but I have been having the conversation with other D&I professionals. So I work for obviously I work for Phoenix, but I volunteer I work with the Prince's Trust. I've worked at Stonewall and CIPD. Actually, I do co-chair the Central London branch, and we've been having some discussions around the events that we're looking to put on for HR and L&D professionals in the next few weeks. Given the from my close kind of my personal commitment to doing everything I possibly can to raise awareness on the issue. I had a really interesting conversation today with one of our directors actually about the word BAME, and I really struggle with that term because I think it's basically non-white. So you're basically putting everyone into a nice little tick box, and I think it's come from the civil service, and it's been, I think, I understand. We do need, I think, in order to address a problem, you need to identify one. So effectively, that's what you do by labeling, I guess, which isn't effective. But at the same time, how can you progress a narrative without knowing what you're talking about and having a commonality and understanding that that's what I'm talking about? I think for me, the answer lies in an individualized approach. And actually, that's a way of, for me, that's an ideology. That's a cultural way of thinking, which is moving. And I'm looking at this from purely a corporate perspective, so appreciate that the conversation I'm having is on a corporate level, albeit there's probably learnings from a wider society perspective. But what I mean by that is, we've come from a labor economy, this country in particular, of a very heavily industrialized, factory work, 9 to 5. You go to the office, you're a number, you're a cog in that machine. That's the basis by which our economy has then moved into the knowledge economy in the last couple of decades. And actually, the focus from a corporate perspective is still stuck in that kind of industrialized, in kind of one for all and all for one type approach, unionized environments where you would all come out and march for your rights, and it was all for one and one for all. But we're in a very different time, now. I think technology has massively changed that. I think the way we are interacting with each other is completely different, and I think that does delve into that D&I issue, which is if you removing that blanket approach, policies and procedures that govern the way we govern. And I'm not saying that I'm not one of those HR radicals that think we shouldn't have any policies. I don't necessarily think that would be the most pragmatic approach, but I think that there is something in saying treat each person as an individual. And I think if you do that as a way of thinking, as an ideological shift, you'll address the issue on D&I, because you'll be having a conversation with each person about them and about their way of thinking, about their about who they are as an individual. And I think moving to that individualized approach, looking at treat your workforce and get to know your workforce will help drive some of that conversations. But I guess from a D&I perspective, especially as a BAME, hate that word, individual, it is, I think it's a necessary evil, because I got asked a really interesting question today, which no one's ever asked me before, because I go around going, I hate the word BAME, I hate the word BAME. And then someone asked me to say, someone's like, well, what do you want then? What would you rather have it? And I was like, because I recognize that, to talk about what we want to do, you need to do that. And I think, I said, well, what about ethnic minority? Because then that defocuses the Black, Asian, minority, ethnic, because that groups everyone together. Whereas if you talk about ethnic minorities, you've got more of a level playing field, I guess. But I do recognize that it's a hard one. And I don't know if I've answered your question, Bev. I'm just thinking around, how that potentially could, I don't know.
Yeah. I knew it was a big question when I asked it. And I think I was more interested in getting your thoughts than getting a definitive answer. But yeah, no, I think it is interesting that as somebody who would carry that BAME label, you particularly don't like that term. And I think, I'm going to be maybe a bit controversial here. As a white woman, I can't relate to being Asian. I can't relate to being a man. I can't relate to any of that. So I can only learn from what I hear by talking to people and being curious and, trying to find out. And I think that I suppose the benefit of labels is that it gives me something to hang my hat on when I'm trying to learn. But the danger of labels is they're labels. So I then put people into boxes. So now I don't have an answer either. But it's an interesting conversation.
Absolutely. I think the fact that we're having a conversation about it and speaking about things in this way and role modeling that, I think, to others as well, listening to this particular podcast or actually seeing what's happening on LinkedIn is I feel this time the movement, specifically in light of what's happened on a global scale, which is horrific and disgusting, has meant that I felt this is different. I do feel that there's a difference this time round, and I really hope and pray that we're able to get to a point where we can just have those conversations, because I think we have the human nature is like right over wrong. I mean, we always have that kind of right versus right, and this isn't necessarily about this. Like you say, it's a shared understanding, right? You can't understand until you ask. I say that. I'm a big believer in that, and I think those uncomfortable conversations are difficult in a corporate setting, because if you look at how we have erected our approach to employee relations in the workplace, we are heavily discouraged from talking about race, protected characteristics, gender, political views, because of the fear of us going to court, right? That's the primary driver, that you don't feel encouraged to talk about those issues or that parts of who you are at work, to remove the element of to remove the risk of being taken to an employment tribunal. That entire ideology needs to be dismantled, because it is in those very workplaces where you may be able to interact with people and come across people that you may or may not be able to in your personal life, that encourages that growth and encourages that conversation. So how do you do that safely, and how do you start to see corporate organizations playing more of a role in citizenship, rather than holding on to this hierarchical, fear-driven, really, kind of environments where we've made, we've basically dehumanized the workplace.
Mm-hmm. I've got an interesting example. I'm not going to share my results. Sorry, guys, I've got a frog in my throat today. And because I've got an unusual Welsh name, and not many people get it right. And
how do you say it? Sorry, just while you're on that, because I was like, I heard Pete say something like.
Yes, it's Dyfrig. Everybody calls me
Dyfrig. Right. Okay. Yeah. Cool.
And because my name's so unusual, even in Wales, actually, I'm always really curious and interested about other people's names and where they're from, because it's not always obvious. But it was really interesting that not that long ago, I came across something that said you should never ask somebody about their name and where it's from, because you could be then labeling them or pigeonholing them. I'm thinking, that's going back to what you're saying around avoiding the conversation.
Exactly.
And when I get, when we do face-to-face sessions, or I go to a conference or a networking event, if somebody's got a name that's not normal in inverted commas, maybe it's not one of the first things I'd say, but through my natural curiosity about learning about people, not about their ethnicity or
yeah.
It's just like, I'm really interested about where that comes from. As an example, because I want to get to know that person as a person.
Absolutely.
Not about sticking them in a box. It was really interesting coming across this conversation about you shouldn't ask people about where the name's from, because that doesn't make sense to me.
Well, I mean, that was how people use my name. Is very unusual. I feel your cause, Dyfrig, because I'm. Woosh is an abbreviation, actually. My full name is not spelled like this. It's spelled Woojdan. So it's an Arabic name. The J is like pronounced like sh, so it's Woojdan, like my full name. I've got my accent out there and everything. And I've had every analogy, I've had every kind of name thrown under this, like literally given to me, and I'd rather that they'd have asked me before. So, and the Starbucks is the worst, because you know when you go and get your coffee and they're like, "What's your name?" and I'm like, "Woosh," and then they'd always be like, and I remember this one time, and they were like, "Took it down," and they're like, "Hot soy latte for Woof," and I was like, "I'm not claiming that. Like, I'm just not gonna go and claim that because that's not my name. Like, Woof was like, you know, I've had all sorts of names, but I do think, you know, I hear what you're saying. It's about, I'm not offended at all if people go, how do I say that? You know, that shows me that they want to get it right and that they respect me as an individual. And that's the kind of stuff that we've forgotten in some of the ways that we've created these, I don't know what to call it, like limitations in how to speak to each other and learn from each other and experience different points of view. You know, that's part of the beauty of us as human beings.
Yeah.
I do worry as well that when we start to put those restrictions on how we talk, we actually create bigger division because, as you said earlier, there's a fear around this, a fear of getting it wrong, but also I think maybe there's an anger at being limited in what you're able to say. And, you know, I think we're all going to get it wrong. As men, you're going to get it wrong when you're talking to a woman. As a white person, I'm going to get it wrong talking to a person of color. You know, I mean, the bulk of my role as a trainer and facilitator is about raising awareness within corporations and businesses around the impact of menopause in the workplace, which is another diversity issue.
Yeah, absolutely.
And people will get it wrong, and I think there's certainly a responsibility on me as a menopausal woman not to take too much offence if somebody says something that, you know, is not ill intended, but possibly ill chosen.
Yeah, absolutely. And it is, you know, curiosity, I think, is the key to some of this enablement, some of this change. So you know, it is about it's creating safe spaces for people to feel that they can ask questions. And I think, you know, if you get that right and be prepared to hear things that you may react to and go, what? But it's that moment for that individual that they realize, you know, that it's to take the stigma out of it, I think, which helps, I think, creates the most growth.
Pete, you're very quiet there.
Yeah, sorry. I was just about to speak, and then we went on. But tolerance. I always find it's a little bit paradoxical, isn't it? Because tolerance is, you know.
Could you want to repeat that, Pete? Zoom wasn't friendly to you there.
Oh, wasn't it my friend?
No.
Oh. Little outtake for us there. Then can you hear me okay now?
Yes. Yeah, you just froze. Go ahead.
Okay, cool. What the point I was looking to make, you probably hear the dog in the background now, apologies, but the point I was looking to make was around tolerance being paradoxical. It is almost, tolerance and intolerance is such a sort of merry-go-round, so to speak. I had a really interesting conversation this week around the current situation we're facing with diversity and inclusion, and the situation we've seen with America and what have you. And the person I was speaking to had a really interesting point of view, which was around that actually, whilst there is a potential race issue, that actually, from a social point of view, an economic point of view, there's actually still an underlying class issue that people don't want to address.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I was just interested, especially with the work you're doing as well, sort of what your take was on that perspective.
Yeah, it's a very, very good question. I think social mobility is something that we completely that isn't necessarily spoken about as much as it should be. Especially when it comes to work on, if you look at race and social mobility, there's such a causal link there. I mean, the Bain report that was released this week around, you know, why is COVID-19 having such a disproportionate impact on the BAME communities? You know, part of that is access to healthcare, and that's as a result of social mobility issues. So I do think there's some strong tenuous links across that piece. We find, you know, our main, you know, so our contract providers, you know, so most of the funding comes from local authorities, so we will get a range of people accessing that support and treatment. What I've what I am interested in from I guess from looking at it from my perspective, from a HR L&D perspective, is that access to employment, that I think is a real key enabler in some of that diversity of thought, not just necessarily looking at protected characteristics, because absolutely, you know, it is about different experiences across the piece. And so, you know, the apprenticeship levy, you know, we've started to see some of that work around the refocusing that, you know, you don't necessarily need to go to university and get a degree to have a great, you know, to have a great career. But I don't necessarily think we've done enough to really break that down for people and make that accessible and give them understanding of that. And I'm talking from, you know, my own experience and my family, my cousins, etc., and the different routes that they've taken, and access to it specifically for the BAME communities, I think is something that we need to do more on, and certainly a commitment I'll be making as part of the work that we do to explore that is that social mobility issue. Is about, okay, how do we attract talent from, and how do we view talent? I think that lends itself to the conversation, because we've always had these one of the events that I'm looking to run in the next few weeks is called Why Do All Directors Look the Same? And it's about because if you don't necessarily provide that role visibility of how you can progress your career, or that you too could, you can see yourself in those roles or positions or places of organizations, is how then can you expect people to understand that that's something that's accessible to them. So I think that is a really for me anyway, specifically for the strategy that I'm looking to develop at Phoenix, is about that accessibility and kind of representation, really, of bringing in a diverse group of people.
Brilliant. We always talk about diversity and inclusion. We kind of clump them together and talk about them as a whole. But I certainly have seen organisations that are very diverse but not inclusive.
Yes.
Yes. Great point. Yeah.
Yeah, and we talk and equality as well. Let's throw that in there. They bundle together as if they're the same thing. And I think a lot of my observation, I don't necessarily have any foundation for this, but my observation is that there's an awful lot of work done to be seen to be diverse. But is the work being done to actually create true inclusivity?
It's such a good point. It baffles me that even now we're still getting I still hear from my networks and circles of senior leaders saying we need to get more gay people into business, or actually we need more black people to work for us. I have some strong views on that, because you can bring. I always say my analogy has always been on the D&I work that I've done is equality is having a seat at the table, diversity is being able to have a voice, and inclusion is having that voice heard. And so for me, you can bring in all the different people around the table. And, for some people, you don't have to try particularly hard to do that, because you'll work in diverse communities where you will by default get diverse talent coming through your organizations. Inclusion is where I would suggest, whenever I get commissioned to do any D&I consultancy or any work around this particular area, the first question I ask isn't, give me your workforce statistics of your representation, but can I have a look at your annual survey and any kind of employee engagement kind of initiatives that you've taken, and see what people are saying. And it's in those comments, not necessarily the tick boxes, but the free text where people can share what they're really thinking, that you get an idea of that. Because as you so rightly and eloquently pointed out, being diverse doesn't necessarily mean you're inclusive. And if you're not inclusive, you're not going to be diverse, because people won't stick around. I've left many an organization on that very ground. I've heard racist comments. I've heard homophobic comments. And I'm not saying that, and there's been a culture of tolerance, actually, and working in HR where you're supposed to govern that type of approach, for me, it was the real conflict of value. So you will lose talent, I say, just as easily as you find it, if you're not tackling your root causes in your culture. So behavioral change is what you're seeking to achieve through inclusion, and if you get that right, then the diversity will by default follow, because your employer brand will signal that. Interestingly enough, talking about that employer brand piece, it's no well and good. This is the same for Black Lives Matter. All the organizations that did Blackout Tuesday and hashtag Black Lives Matter, and I think the anger this time around, the justifiable anger, is for authenticity in the messaging now from organizations, not just that tick box, we care about this situation. And for me, I think one thing that's really interesting is obviously we now live in an age from an employer talent perspective where you've got Glassdoor, you've got LinkedIn, you've got such an openness in your organizations and transparency that your employer brand will speak for itself. If you focus on the inclusion, that will resonate in the feedback that your organizations will receive. Without that, it's going to be very, very difficult, I think, specifically now and the kind of point of change that we're seeing, for you to retain diverse talent if you're not focusing on that inclusion.
And of course, there's clear bottom line benefit as well. So you talk about the human side of it, the society side, but from a business, whether that's a charity, or just a private sector, there's bound to be, my gut tells me, and I've got no numbers in front of me and I haven't looked at any yet, but there's bound to be a bottom line benefit from having
yeah.
So, and you said, to use your phrase, why do all directors look the same? But if as an example, you've got a business and they are all white middle class, as an example, the easy category, but then you are living and working and most of your customers are not from that community, if you like, then you're missing a trick because you're not getting that. And also as well, if one of your sites is in one city in the UK where it's mostly white middle class, as an example, then you go to another site where it's Asian, just like, there's always going to be culture differences in sites, but there's going to be such a disparity of thought and thinking and innovation and all these things, and understanding people and understanding your customers. So I don't suppose you have customers in the true sense, but the people that you serve, if you like, there's going to be so many negative consequences of really not having diversity of thought.
Absolutely. I could not agree. I think the really pertinent points there. I couldn't agree more. It is. I always say it's a way of thinking. Before you think, I think with diversity, you think black, gay, pride flag, all the stuff that we do. That's what we've kind of created. We've created an industry for diversity and inclusion that focuses specifically on that cosmetic piece. But for me, I think diversity is a way of thinking. It's about knowing that I have a view and you have a view. Your view might be different to my view, but that's okay. And I think for me, that's what I boiled it down to in everything that I'm trying to do, is that kind of builds on that tolerance piece, and understanding differences of thought, as you say, because it will drive innovation. One of the most dangerous phrases in talent, and I tell this to my talent team daily, is cultural fit. We're hiring for cultural fit. Oh, they weren't quite right because they weren't the cultural fit. You want people to go against the grain. You want people that you think like you and you are you. Why would you want to be surrounded with the same kind of thoughts and ideas? Because you're not really then going to access that true opportunity or harness that understanding, like you say, innovate to take your organization to the next level. And in this day and age, with such a competitive environment that we live in, what organization wouldn't want to innovate to continually make sure that they're not, that they are ahead of the curve?
Survive.
Absolutely. Survive. Absolutely. So absolutely resonates, all of those points. Absolutely, diversity of thought.
And it's fascinating, isn't it, with organizations that they'll go, we need this kind of person, and it might be a specialism, so you take the person out of it. And then you bring them in, and then within 6 months you try and mold them into what is the cultural norm.
Yeah,
you can't do that. You mustn't do this, and you mustn't behave in that way. But actually, you just get this homogenized workforce, and then the talented people, like you said, regardless of their background or whatever, then decide to leave because they feel that they can't shake things up and make a difference. And most people, especially in professional roles, they want to go in and make a positive difference.
Yeah,
It's
absolutely.
really limiting so many things in your organization.
Absolutely. And it's not necessarily I'm not saying it's a deliberate intent when people recognize that when you look around you and you go, oh, okay, and that penny drop moment, because groupthink happens all the time without even us, without even realizing groupthink happens. I get like that with groupthink when we talk about LGBT and I'm talking to like people in Stonewall, and I'm like, actually, all of us are gay men here. Like, where's the, where is the wider thinking around this? And you can get into that trap so quickly. it's recognizing that, I think, and then not being afraid. I think people see this particular issue as one of saying it's a competency issue. I might not be competent. I might, I don't have all the answers. Well, who does have all the answers in this day and age, in the world that we live in? It's about being okay with that and not necessarily being threatened by the fact that you don't know.
Woosh, can I ask you, what's been your biggest challenge or the biggest challenges in trying to raise awareness of diversity and inclusion issues? I know you do a lot of work with the CIPD. What's been the challenges and the resistance that you've come up against?
I think the challenges recently have been, and I'll speak about the HR and L&D profession first, and then I potentially might look at it from an organisational perspective. But if we're looking at it from the HR and L&D professional perspective, and that certainly speaks to the work that I do with CIPD, is I think we have desensitised the agenda, and I think we have, to my earlier points, dehumanised the issue, and I think we are at risk of making this an academic theoretical issue. There is academic principles that underpin D&I, understand racism and social constructs, but actually what I fail to see in HR, and I count myself in this because I'm just as equally as culpable as anyone else in HR, is we haven't stood up to our organizations in the face of discrimination or in the faces of toxic cultures, racism, and we haven't done enough to dismantle that. And I think the reason is that for years and years and years, HR has been fighting for a seat at that table to have that strategic dialogue, right? So we talked about that earlier, the whole perception of hiring and firing, and we finally can see chief people officers, chief HR officers, and HR directors, and strategic HR thinking, all of that, great. But there's a fear that if we speak up, that we will potentially be pushed back into that little office environment, or be taken out. We will be removed from the conversation. But I think the time is. I think that that if that is a risk that that we see, then the organisations that are making those decisions aren't going to be around in 5 years or 10 years. So I think for me, the challenges I'm seeing specifically in HR is I feel like we talk a lot about the issue. We go to webinars and we network about it, and we all go, oh yeah, isn't it bad? Isn't it bad? What are we then doing to dismantle that within our own organizations? And I would like to ask that question. I do that right now. And it's, for me, I've really I've recognized where my shortcomings have been in that. So I've looked back and I thought, actually, I should have said that, and I should have said that. My own personal commitment to that is I will speak out. And I think that the time is now, because there is a significant global push in that direction, and actually we should be benefiting from, we should really be utilizing that, to make those meaningful discussions and have those changes. So that would be, I think, the significant challenge I think the HR and L&D profession I've certainly experienced. From an organizational standpoint, I think the challenges that I see is how to make those initiatives authentic. I think not to just literally stand up and go, yeah, we're going to be diverse because we have to be, or because it's cool right now, or it's trending, but actually taking a good, long, hard look at ourselves, our organizations, and really having some I call it uncomfortable conversations, or speak your truth. You speak those truths and put it out on the table, and it's going to be ugly and it's going to be messy, but you're going to get if you go with that, you're going to get a lot more than if you change your colors to the Pride logo because it's Pride Month. So I think that's probably the challenges that I think I've come across from an organization. And both of those that I've mentioned, the HR and L&D and the organization, both of those stem from an uncomfortable conversation. And it's time that we have that uncomfortable conversation, and it's time we put our money where our mouth is, I think. And that's certainly the conversations that I'm having, right now, in terms of how we dismantle this once and for all.
In your opinion, who are the bright spots out there? Which organisations are getting it right at the minute?
Well, I mean, I think I've seen some really reassuring examples, specifically coming out of I think America, obviously, because it's a burning platform that they have to get right in terms of police brutality and the systemic issues that the USA have had in relation to Black Lives Matter. But I think some of so I know PepsiCo have spoken out, really the CEO saying, this, we're going to invest, we're going to put our money where our mouth is. Again, people donating to putting money into Black communities, Black businesses, Black campaigns, has been really reassuring. I think it was great to see Melinda Gates, as I know she's like an entrepreneur, but she kind of and I really admire that. She was like, I've got privilege, I have a platform, I've got loads of people that follow me, I'm going to give my Instagram or my LinkedIn account to a female, I'm going to put a female Black voice front and center for the day. And I thought, wow, those little things, so just recognizing what you can do to amplify those voices, I think is brilliant. Nike, I think, have done really, really well as part of their advertisement campaigns. They have they've brought it out, I think, as I've said this has just been really I think they've pushed it as quite far in a really refreshing way to disregard the political aspects of them coming out in the way that they came out, and I think that was really inspiring to see. I don't necessarily think I've seen enough in this country, and I'm going to be honest. I think because some of the conversations I've seen are very much around, oh, well, it's a USA issue, it's not a UK issue, and I think that's ridiculous. And I think so there's that kind of coming through in the sense of, I think we will start to see the traction, and I really don't want to offend anyone listening thinking we've done a lot as our organizations, because I'm sure there have been some great examples. I think what I would like to see more is that national focus on it now, as we start to recognize the systemic issues that happening in relation to racism in this country, which there are. So I think, I note with interest what I'm seeing on LinkedIn. And I do think, say a few global organizations that I've seen that have really, L'Oreal have kind of asked Monroe Bergdorf to join the diversity and inclusion panel as a consultant, and in 2016 they made that ridiculous decision to take her out of their L'Oreal campaign as the first transgender woman, on the basis that she spoke out against white privilege. And there was that whole issue with Piers Morgan, her coming on Good Morning, and Piers basically, berating her for what does white privilege mean? This doesn't mean da da da. Well, how great an example, because then at the end of the back of her comments about white privilege and her being quite outspoken on those issues, L'Oreal dropped her. Well, they've now rehired her on the most senior level to advise them on how to manage their D&I agenda. Now that is an organization that's saying we've made a mistake and we're going to go and correct that mistake. And I think that is the mentality that I would love to see more. Is we have a really, corporate image is always a big thing, isn't it, in companies, like, oh, let's modify this, let's speak to the comms team, let's do that. I think what people are wanting is an authenticity in the message, and if you got it wrong, you've got it wrong, but you've got a chance now to do something about that and to make meaningful change.
That takes vulnerability, doesn't it? Though
Absolutely.
you've got to allow, and as a big organisation like L'Oreal, I did some work with L'Oreal around menopause last year. You're putting it takes courage and vulnerability to put your hand up and say, we messed up, but we're going to do something about it.
Yeah, absolutely.
And that's a stronger message, isn't it? Rather than, you said, sticking, changing your company logo to the pride colours or whatever it is. That's absolutely much more meaningful. They probably don't even need to do, I don't know if they have or not, but they don't need to do that, I guess, because what they've done speaks a lot more, especially globally, but to specific communities as well.
Absolutely.
We're coming up to the hour mark, and I say this every week. I must be sounding like a stuck record, but it just flies by. It goes by so quickly. We actually love this Friday afternoon slot, Woosh, because we just chat and it's lovely. So
it is nice.
What I would really like to do before we wrap up is just to ask Dev and Pete, is there anything more that you want to ask Woosh or make an observation or anything before I want to ask you to kind of tell us how we can help Phoenix in any way? So, guys, any questions?
Yeah, I've got one question, and that is, for the people who are listening now on the podcast, and bear in mind, this will be out there in the ether, potentially forever, for eternity. What one simple thing could people do? Let's take it down to the individual level rather than the organisation level, just to raise that awareness and have that diversity of thought, I think.
So I'm gonna focus my answer on Black Lives Matter, because I think I've got a platform, as you've asked me that question, to focus on that particular issue. And I think one thing I would say is, and this really resonated with me, because we call it a BAME issue, it's not. It affects Black people. Let's focus on Black community right now, given what's going on. And I think that for me, that one thing would be to not to use your Black friend as Google, as they say. So, I think we're seeing a lot of, what's it like being Black, now because of what's happening. And actually that's exhausting for anyone, and especially like I have the same from an LGBT perspective. I've never had a gay friend before. Like I've never had and it's well-meaning, but I think the one thing people can do is when people say educate themselves, that doesn't necessarily mean you have to go and use someone else's experience and history of racism and their discrimination and get that out. Go on Google and type in Black Lives Matter, and there's loads of resources out there. So I would say the one thing is to utilize the resources at your disposal without necessarily using that kind of that tokenistic approach of just going to that one person that you may go to. I think that would be, for me, the biggest aspect of it. Is people have said to me, I don't know where to start. I said, well, what have you done? And they were like, I don't know where to have that conversation. Well, it's not a conversation. It's you taking the time to read a book, or to listen to this podcast, or to watch Netflix and watch, there's loads of, there's curated content on the lives, Black history, documentaries. There's a lot that you can do that doesn't necessarily mean you're opening that person's life up in an effort to try and educate yourself.
Great answer. Thank you.
Yeah, and of course that is only just that one person's experience of their life, so it's
Absolutely,
not really a true reflection of
exactly.
Pete.
Yeah, perfect. So one of the things I do is we do quite a range of training, mostly with blue collar workers, particularly with HGV drivers, and predominantly they're white males. However, quite often I will have men, particularly men, generally men, but occasionally women, from other cultures, from other ethnicities as well. And we talk about mental health. We do a half-day mental health workshop with them. We talk about drug and alcohol abuse. Have you got any sort of quick top tips for that? Can be quite a challenging conversation for me, especially when I've got a diverse group with very different perspectives. Any quick tips for me to help my skills on that?
Oh God,
No pressure.
What specifically around drug and alcohol?
More around attitude towards mental health actually is a big challenge.
So, really good point. Really good question. I don't know if I can. Facilitation is a really powerful way of progressing a narrative and progressing a conversation, specifically if you don't. So I think the element I'd focus on is how are they engaging with that particular piece of work. So we always say about that parent-child dynamic or adult-to-adult dynamic. So I think that really speaks volumes in the work that we're talking about when it comes to stigma, and it comes to having those conversations, transparent and honest conversations. So I would say, from a facilitator's perspective, safety is so important in a meaningful and honest conversation. So whatever you can do to make that situation and that environment as safe as you possibly can, I would focus on that. And I think the rest will follow, because if you get one person speaking out, you will initiate, you will see that will bring about that conversation. So, and I know, sorry, I'm apologies, that's slightly broad and quite generic, but with that, I've always found that in order to my best work is in the most uncomfortable conversations, right? That's something I've really recognized. So from a trainer perspective or a facilitator perspective, if I feel uncomfortable, as weird as that may feel, I know I'm in the right zone. So if I feel like it's too normalized, or if it's just too easy for me, I don't know if this is making sense, but I know I'm not doing enough on that conversation.
Yeah, total sense.
So that would be what I would say, and I hope that kind of makes sense.
It makes total sense. Sorry,
I was just going to say, if I can jump in on that, because I so resonate with this, and my conversation is always around menopause, and when you talk to men about menopause, it's an uncomfortable conversation sometimes. But I think sometimes as facilitators and trainers, we want to see an instant reaction. We want to see an instant change in behaviour, or an instant change in the thought processes, and it doesn't always happen in the classroom. Sometimes those realizations and those learnings happen long after they've left our classroom, after the conversations had time to sink in. And I think we put a lot of pressure on ourselves as facilitators to get instant change.
Absolutely.
But anyway,
that's a really good point.
Yeah, fabulous conversation, Woosh. Thank you so much for joining us.
I've really enjoyed it. This has been the best way to end the week, I must say.
It?
Yeah.
And I will tell you, I've just discovered how to play music on a Zoom call. So I was thinking of having like intro and outro.
Like
we have it on the we have it on the I edited into the podcast, but I was thinking we could have like a little disco going at the start and the end of the podcast. What do you reckon?
I'll give my glitter ball.
Dub's looking particularly uncomfortable now. Go away, let it resonate. Have a thought. Have a think.
I'll have a think about it. Yeah.
Woosh, who are your ideal sort of charity supporters? Who's this best to get in front of? Who may be able to help the charity from a fundraising point of view, or finance, or in any way really? I don't want to.
Yeah. I think it was a very good question. Our primary focus has really been government in campaigning passionately for addictions treatment, but also I think what this pandemic fleshed out, which I really, I know our CEO is really, really passionate about this, is the skilled workers versus unskilled workers, that we get that terminology in healthcare. And I think, it would be great if we were able to somehow leverage those that work in, say, the civil service, or anyone that was able to potentially, inform decision making at that kind of strategic level, to think long and hard about the, addictions. And also we're seeing that result of mental health, actually. So we know that as a result of isolation and as a result of the pandemic, we are seeing an increase in mental health, and that has necessarily look at behaviours such as, addiction, drinking. And so I think that puts, I guess, puts that emphasis back on the type of work that we do. So I guess for me, it's really around, those kind of, I guess, who could help our organisation in making that case would be, I guess, other health and social care providers, other people who work in this particular space, particularly, people who work for government and public sector, who could potentially help champion this message and just really kind of, I guess, cheerlead the work that we're doing and really amplify that voice. Would be hugely appreciative of that.
Brilliant. And how can people find Phoenix Futures? I take it there's web sort of.
Yes, there is.
A web presence and things.
Yes, we have a website which is going through a bit of a we've got a website, and we'll be refreshing that in the coming months. We have a LinkedIn page. We've got social media. We've got a Twitter account, so I can hopefully send that over to you, so we can include that with podcasts.
Definitely. Woosh, thank you so much. We normally end the podcast on a little bit of a round robin around what we've learned this week. So if you'll bear with us, Dov, what have your learnings been this week?
Well, as always, there's been lots. But I just want to pick out one thing which ties into this conversation, actually. And I had a conversation with somebody who will be a guest on the podcast in the autumn. And it's really interesting that when we often look at the differences in people and we make assumptions about what we don't have in common, we don't see the stuff that we absolutely have in common. So I had a conversation with an 18-year-old Asian man earlier this week. And after having a conversation for an hour, it was supposed to be on something completely different. We ended up just talking about everything but what we were supposed to be talking about. And it's amazing how just through behavior and attitude and lots of behavioral stuff on a human level, how much in common you're going to have with somebody with such different age, different religion, different ethnicity, all those kind of things, that how much you can actually have in someone. And it's not something that I was not aware of before, but I think it's just reinforced learning, and just that point that often we do have much more in common than we have that's different.
Absolutely.
That was our learning.
Brilliant learning. A reinforcement, as you say. Pete, have you had time to learn anything, or have you just been catching your tail all week?
I've been chasing my tail a lot this week. However, I think I've had quite a bit of reinforcement, and Woosh has just done that for me as well with approaching conversations and not my worry is always about saying the wrong thing. You know, especially on my podcast too, and asking questions and what have you. But actually, it's all about creating that safe space. And regardless of what I say in that safe space, if it's a safe space that I've created, it's okay, really, because it comes from a place of caring. So
Absolutely.
that's my takeaway this week for the weekend.
Brilliant. Woosh, do you want to join in, or would you like me to bypass?
It's been inspired actually, and some real thoughts for me around, like you say, reinforcing it from a different perspective. I think sometimes we can get insular when we work in our own organizations and when we have that broader conversation. So for me, it's really heartening that everything I'm saying is or, you know, hopefully it's ringing true. I feel for me that for me, it's not necessarily a learning, it's more of a nourishment of the work that, you know, that I'm seeking to do, and the change that we're trying to achieve, you know, collectively. So for me, just the fact that I'm, you know, having this conversation with people who, you know, really are opening themselves up in a way that encourages authenticity is really heartening. So for me, that's been a real huge takeaway.
Brilliant. Well, mine has definitely been around learning to allow myself to ask those probing questions that feel uncomfortable, but asking them with good intent. And I think that there's a danger that many of us are too scared to ask the questions. And that sounds a bit deep, doesn't it? But no, it is. It's about finding the courage to. I get talking about vulnerability. It's when you're asking uncomfortable questions and you're putting yourself in uncomfortable places, you've got to put yourself in a position of vulnerability, and maybe there will be a bit of backlash. Maybe I will get it wrong, but I'd rather get it wrong and learn than not put myself out there in the first place. So.
Yeah, absolutely.
Brilliant. Guys, have a fabulous weekend.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me. And
It's
likewise.
been a pleasure.
Take care.
Bye.
Everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us on the Stronger for Business podcast. A final thought before we go. In the words of Henry Ford, anyone who stops learning is old, whether at 20 or 80. Anyone who keeps learning stays young. So, stay young and join us next Friday for our next episode of the Stronger for Business podcast.